Cane toads are on the march, sweeping across northern Australia into the wilds of the Kimberley. It's been disastrous for local wildlife, but local rangers are taking on the toads with the help of science.
For nearly a century, Australia fought an enemy it could not beat. Not a shark, not a crocodile, not a bushfire, a toad. A slow, ugly, warty amphibian that should have been the easiest invader on the planet to stamp out. Instead, it spread across an entire continent, killed off predators that had ruled the landscape for tens of millions of years, and shrugged off every weapon humans threw at it. Poison baits failed. Physical barriers failed. Culling squads with buckets and headlamps failed. And then, almost by accident, researchers noticed something happening at the edge of a muddy waterhole that would eventually turn the entire war around. It didn't involve a laboratory. It didn't involve government funding on any serious scale. It involved an ant, a splash of wet cat food, and a narrow window of a few weeks each year when the invader was at its most helpless. To understand why that discovery mattered so much, you have to go back to where this entire disaster began, because the origin of the cane toad in Australia is one of the clearest examples in history of a fix that made the problem infinitely worse. In 1935, sugarcane growers in Queensland were losing their crops to a beetle. The cane beetle's larvae tunneled through the roots of sugarcane, and nothing available at the time could touch them efficiently. Someone had heard that in parts of Central and South America, a large toxic toad preyed on beetles and other pests, and that similar toads had already been introduced into some Pacific Island sugar economies with supposedly promising results. The logic seemed sound enough on paper: import a predator, let it eat the pest, solve the problem without chemicals. So a little over 100 cane toads were shipped in and released into cane fields north of Cairns. The plan collapsed almost immediately, though nobody realized it at the time. The beetles that were destroying the sugarcane lived high up on the stalks, well above where a squat, ground-bound toad could ever reach them. The toads never touched the pest they were brought in to control. But by the time anyone understood that the entire premise was flawed, it no longer mattered. Because the toads had already discovered something far more valuable than beetles, an entire continent of prey animals that had never seen anything like them before, and absolutely no natural predators willing to attack them. That last part is the detail that turned an ordinary invasive species into an ecological catastrophe. Every cane toad carries poison glands on its shoulders capable of secreting a milky toxin that attacks the heart. In their native range, this toxin evolved alongside predators that had millions of years to develop resistance or avoidance behavior. In Australia, nothing had that history. A goanna that grabbed a toad in its jaws had no idea it was about to die. Neither did a quoll, nor a freshwater crocodile, nor dozens of species of native snake. The toxin didn't just deter these animals, it killed them, often within minutes, the very first time they tried to eat one. And the toads didn't need to be dangerous to spread, they needed to be prolific, and they were spectacularly good at that too. A single breeding female can produce tens of thousands of eggs in one season, and she can breed more than once a year. With nothing eating them in large enough numbers to matter, the population didn't grow steadily, it exploded. Within a few decades, the descendants of that first shipment had turned into a wall of toads stretching across the entire top of the continent, and that wall kept moving. What made the advance even more alarming was that the toads themselves were changing as they spread. Biologists who studied the animals at the leading edge of the invasion found they had measurably longer legs and greater endurance than toads from the older, established populations far behind the front. This wasn't mysterious, it was simple evolutionary logic. The toads that happened to be built for covering more ground were the ones defining the invasion's leading wave, generation after generation. So the front line kept getting faster. What had crawled a few dozen feet a year in the early decades was, by recent years, advancing tens of kilometers annually in some regions, cutting a swath through the Northern Territory and pushing deep into Western Australia. Behind that advancing front, the destruction to native wildlife was staggering. Quoll populations, small, fierce marsupial predators, collapsed by more than 90% in many affected regions within just a few years of the toad's arrival. Large monitor lizards vanished from territories they had occupied for longer than humans have existed on the continent. Even saltwater crocodiles, apex predators with almost nothing capable of threatening them, were found dead with half-swallowed toads lodged in their throats. When predators disappear that quickly, the damage doesn't stop with them. The species those predators used to keep in check multiply unchecked, and the balance of an entire ecosystem starts to unravel within a handful of breeding seasons. Australia responded with everything available. Government-funded toad musters sent volunteers out with bags and buckets to physically remove animals by hand. Researchers tested chemical repellents, pheromone traps, even genetic approaches aimed at disrupting toad reproduction. Fences and barriers were proposed to slow the spread across key corridors. None of it worked at a scale that mattered. You cannot outcollect a population numbering in the hundreds of millions using human labor, and every year the front moved a little faster than it had the year before. For most of the 20th century and well into this one, there was no credible plan for actually turning the invasion back, only ways to slightly slow it down. The turning point came from watching, not from a lab bench. Field researchers monitoring toad breeding sites in the north kept noticing the same pattern at the water's edge. Newly transformed baby toads, the ones just past the tadpole stage, still soft-bodied and barely able to move, were being swarmed by meat ants, a large, aggressive, copper-colored and common across Australian grasslands. What caught the researchers' attention wasn't that the ants were attacking the toads. It was that the ants weren't dying afterward. That single observation flipped the entire question. Instead of asking how humans might finally kill enough toads to matter, scientists started asking why this particular native insect seemed completely unbothered by a toxin that could stop a crocodile's heart. The explanation turned out to be almost embarrassingly simple once someone looked closely. The toad's poison is devastating to vertebrates because it disrupts the electrical signaling that keeps a heart beating, a mechanism shared by every mammal, reptile, and amphibian on the planet. Insects don't have that kind of circulatory or cardiac system at all. Their bodies run on entirely different biological wiring. So the toxin that flatlines a monitor lizard's heart is, to an ant, essentially meaningless. It isn't a matter of the ant having built up resistance over generations. The poison simply has nothing to grab onto in an insect's physiology. There was a second factor working against the toad, too, one rooted purely in the ant's hunting style. Meat ants don't attack by biting once and swallowing whole the way a snake or bird does. They attack in overwhelming numbers, delivering dozens or even hundreds of small individual bites across a victim's body at once. Each ant absorbs only a tiny trace of toxin from its own bite, nowhere close to a dose that could harm it, while the combined assault is more than enough to overwhelm and kill the target through sheer physical damage. The cane toad's defense had evolved for a world of predators that tried to eat it in one motion. It had never encountered a predator that succeeds by attacking it in pieces. When researchers ran side-by-side comparisons between cane toads and several species of native Australian frogs exposed to the same ant colonies, the results were stark. Every single native frog species outperformed the cane toad in escaping an ant attack, not by a small margin, but decisively, across every measure of reaction speed and jump distance. The native frogs had spent millions of years living alongside meat ants and had developed the instinctive response that actually works against them: freeze for a split second, then explode away in one powerful leap before the swarm can fully mobilize. The cane toad had no such instinct. Its entire defensive playbook was built around trusting its poison and staying still, which against an ant attack is close to the worst possible strategy available. This is where the idea for an active countermeasure took shape, led by researchers including ecologist Georgia Wardfear, who had spent years studying the invasion's front line. If meat ants were already killing baby toads naturally, the obvious next question was whether their effectiveness could be deliberately concentrated at exactly the right place and time. The method that emerged was almost comically low-tech: cheap tins of wet cat food, placed along the muddy banks of known toad breeding ponds. Meat ant colonies respond intensely to protein-rich food sources. A small amount of bait doesn't just attract a handful of foragers. It triggers a full colony response, drawing thousands of workers to patrol and defend the area for hours at a stretch. Timed correctly, that response could be aimed directly at the most vulnerable moment in a cane toad's entire life cycle, the days when tens of thousands of newly transformed baby toads are forced out of the water and onto land simultaneously. That timing window is brutal by nature, even before any ants show up. A freshly transformed toad has lost its gills and can no longer breathe underwater, but its skin hasn't toughened enough yet to survive far from moisture, so it's trapped in a narrow strip of wet mud right at the shoreline. Adult cane toads are cannibals, which pushes the babies to leave the safety of the water during daylight hours, when adult activity nearby is lower. Unfortunately for the toads, daylight is also exactly when meat ant colonies are most active. The toads are being pushed, by their own biology, directly into the ants' peak hunting window, on terrain, churned and crated by livestock hooves in many regions, that traps their tiny bodies before an ant ever reaches them. When researchers deployed cat food bait along shorelines timed to this emergence window, the results exceeded almost every expectation. In monitored trials, well over 90% of emerging baby toads were located and killed by ant colonies within minutes of leaving the water. At some sites, an entire season's cohort, tens of thousands of animals, was effectively eliminated at a single pond before a single individual reached adulthood. Meanwhile, native frog species breeding in the same ponds showed no meaningful increase in mortality at all, because their ant evasion instincts still worked exactly as they had for millions of years. The ants were acting as a precise biological filter, punishing the species that couldn't escape them and leaving the ones that could almost entirely untouched. None of this is being treated as a simple victory lap, and the scientists running these trials are careful to say so. Australia's history with ecological fixes is exactly why caution matters here. The cane toad itself is proof of what happens when a solution is introduced without fully understanding the consequences. Meat ants are native, not an imported organism, which removes one major risk. But pushing any species artificially above its normal density can still ripple outward in unpredictable ways. That's why the baiting approach is being run as a targeted, seasonal tool rather than a blanket treatment. Specific ponds, specific weeks tied to peak emergence, with monitoring in place to catch unintended effects early. Even with that caution, the numbers behind the strategy are enormous. Every young female toad prevented from reaching adulthood represents tens of thousands of eggs per season that never enter the population, compounding across every future breeding cycle she would have had. A single pond cleared at the right moment isn't just one good result. It's a multiplier removed from an equation that has been working against native wildlife for 90 years. Scale that across dozens of key breeding sites along the invasion's active front, season after season, and the population math genuinely starts to bend in the other direction. And there are early signs that it's working. In areas where the baiting program has run across multiple seasons, researchers are documenting qual activity in territories where the species hadn't been recorded in years, and monitor lizards returning to ranges they abandoned when the toad front first swept through. Nobody involved is calling this eradication, because eradication was never realistically on the table for a species this deeply embedded across a continent. The goal is suppression, pushing numbers down enough, consistently enough, that the predators the toad nearly wiped out get room to rebuild. What makes this particular breakthrough stand out isn't the size of the tool. It's where the tool came from. 90 years of chemical trials, physical barriers, and mass culling efforts all tried to impose a solution on the ecosystem from the outside. The ant-based approach did the opposite. It noticed a predator the environment already had, understood exactly why that predator worked when nothing else did, and simply gave it a strategic advantage at the one moment it mattered most. The cane toad's defenses were never actually unbeatable. They were only unbeatable against the kinds of predators it had evolved to face. Against a coordinated swarm of insects attacking from every direction at once, its greatest weapon turned out to be almost entirely useless, and that single mismatch, spotted at the edge of a muddy pond and armed with nothing more than a can of cat food, may be the closest thing Australia has found to turning back an invasion that once looked unstoppable.